Thank you.
Yeah, we are good to go.
Hey, Keith, should I jump right into it?
Yeah, we might as well.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for turning out to our meeting this evening. We have quite a bit of work to review and quite a bit of feedback I'm hoping to receive from you regarding your zoning as it currently stands. So let me take a look at our agenda to orient you in this process. I'll give you an update on where we are at in terms of our scope of work, what we're working on. Then I would like to take some time to review your zoning districts, of which you have many. We've done a review of them. We know what the purpose of those districts are, where they're geographically located, what uses are allowed in them. But I'd really like to hear it from you as to, any history of those districts. Are the district regulations working? Which districts might be newer, problematic? Anything you could share with me to give me some insight into those districts. Then I'm going to compare, we've compared your regulations to a few other communities, just, page count, that sort of thing, just to see how they currently measure up. We've been busy with a line-by-line review of the zoning regulations, so I'll talk about some of the key findings from that to date. Your zoning regulations do have some use summary tables, and we've done a QA/QC review on those to see how they match up to the written regulations, and I'll talk about some disparities that we found. And then I want to talk about state statutes and the zoning implications for those statutes, which we definitely want to make sure the revised zoning is in compliance and is up to date with respect to those statutes. I'll also, if time allows, I'll briefly review the findings from a review of the plans. And we talked a little bit about these plans at the last meeting, your POCD, open space plan, resiliency plan, and the implications those plans have for your zoning, or actually very specific recommendations they have for your zoning. And then we'll talk about next steps. All right, so our phase one, this is where we're at. This is our progress to date. We're on phase one of this effort, and we have been engaged in task 1.1 through 1.3, and that includes the review of relevant plans and documents, the line-by-line review, and review of the use summary table. The next steps in this process, when we've completed all of this work or substantially completed it, is we start to develop content for the reformatted regulations, which includes putting some formats in front of you that we can agree upon, styles and nomenclature, organization, outline, that sort of thing, developing supplemental graphics for the regulations, and then doing the work of actually bringing everything into the new format and organization, and then following that up with adoption and training on the new regs. All right, your zoning districts. I don't think I actually ever counted them, but there's probably around 25 plus districts, including overlay districts. There's a lot of them. And they include a number of residential districts, it's the table on the left, commercial districts, the table on the right, and industrial and special districts, of which many of those are overlay districts. And for those of you that may or may be new to the commission, aren't completely familiar with an overlay district, it's a district, and it's all in the name. It's a district that overlays a base zoning district, and it usually is more restrictive in nature. By example, an overlay district for the coastal area management overlay district. It has all sorts of requirements and regulations regarding coastal zone issues. Sometimes overlay districts can be more permissive, can allow greater densities, smaller lot sizes, whatever it may be. It can work in both directions. But they overlay these other base zoning districts that you have in town, and you have a few different overlay districts. So we'll go through those one by one. Starting with your residential districts. The GBR 130, Greenbelt Residential District, there's the purpose on the left. It's pretty clear that it's intended to be a low density residential district, and the underlying area is primarily aquifer, very important watershed, wetlands, et cetera. And that's a picture from within the district. And that house is probably non-conforming because the setback is not right, but you know, is an example of the anomalies that we deal with in our New England communities. All right, anyone have anything they're interested in sharing with me about this particular district?
Could you let us know where these specifically are?
District?
Oh, geez.
We do have a map that, do we include the map in the presentation? Unfortunately, I don't have the, like a key map handy. So maybe what we could do is I can get through these slides real quick. If you're familiar with the district, any issues related to the district, the history of it, whatever it may be, speak up, and then I can find the map. I can pull it up, and we could pan around if you think that'll be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
And the GBR 130, it tends to be in the more rural parts of towns, away from the coast. So in a lot of the upland areas, and I'm looking up at my big zoning map on the wall here, tends to be found more in the upland areas north of 95 in the more rural areas. And there's a 100-foot non-infringement area from wetlands.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Francisco, I have a quick question. It's Ben again. Just in
Go
general,
ahead.
for a town the size of Stonington, are 25 different districts an anomaly or normal?
It's a lot. It's a lot. And it's owing in part to the fact that you have two historic villages with very nuanced land uses. And so about half of those districts are found within either Mystic or Pawcatuck.
Yep, I have the
That's
atlas in front of
primarily
me.
what it's attributed to.
Yep.
You know,
And just
that you throw in coastal zone issues, and you know, so it starts to get complicated.
And one last message for the board is there is a zoning map atlas the town of Stonington does have for free, for your use in the town hall at the planning department.
I just stuck a link to that in the chat for everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
But there is a hard copy if you want it too in town hall.
Okay.
Thank you, Francisco.
All right, and we have, as I mentioned, 25 maybe districts, so I'll keep this moving. I don't want it to occupy the entire discussion tonight. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and understanding what we're dealing with here. The RC20 is like the coastal version of the GBR 130, and really, as the way I see it, this really could have been all one district because they're pretty much allow the same uses, have very similar bulk area height requirements. The only nuance being that this one is really, the language is tailored towards coastal issues, even though they really regulate things in the same way. So this could have been all one district with just wording that allowed for both, but it mostly found around coastal issues with the purpose of this zone is really to ensure protection of coastal resources and a low density residential development.
One thing I'll add with this is that when the zone was created back in, I think, 1979, the town created these little strips of RC 120 all along the coast. So it's very common to have these residential houses along the coast with just a strip of, let's say, 25 feet of the RC 120, which was put on the zoning map to protect the coastal resources. So you have a lot of lots along the coast with split zones.
Thank you, Keith. All right, moving on to, what more traditional type of residential district, and this is basically a lot-based naming system here. So the rural residential 80s and 80,000 square foot lot minimum, which is a little shy of 2 acres. And there's the purpose right there, low density residential development. Not the same focus on natural resource protection here, and not as many controls for natural resource protection. The RA 40, stepping down in size, same purpose, same allowable uses, but stepping down in lot size, and so increasing in density to a 40,000 square foot, just shy of an acre lot. Otherwise, if you're driving down street in the RR 80 versus RA 40, doesn't look a whole lot different depending where you're at. But in some areas, houses could be spaced a little closer together. RM 20, here you really start to notice a difference in the density of homes, 20,000 square foot lots, a little less than half an acre. And because of the density in these areas, this is where in these areas that are zoned RM 20, it's more likely that those areas will have public utilities like sewer and water service. The RM 15, once again, just reducing lot size, but very similar to the purpose and function of the RM 20. RH 10, residential district, 10,000 square foot lot, starts to get denser. A lot of these areas are in areas that were developed or much longer ago, so they tend to have a more historically based higher density. RA 15, and here's where the count, the count on your zones, that number count really starts to reveal itself. It is, we just went through a spectrum of residential districts and densities, and now we're starting like a whole new spectrum of residential districts and densities. So here's the RA 15. And these are areas where you have much older homes. They preceded zoning. So the zoning was really crafted not to shape the development, but to reflect the development. And it's typical right here, a couple older homes and, relatively small lots. RA 20, 20,000 square foot lot, single family homes as well. And so here we see really a lot of overlap with the other residential zones I just showed you. Here we start to get into more mixed use and some of your village districts, DB5 development area. This is a zone intended for built up areas with sewer and water to allow for a mixture of commercial and residential uses at relatively high densities. And this district is going to look a lot like some of the other districts that I'll show you momentarily. CS5, convenience shopping, and this is typically found in little nodes scattered through town to allow for, neighborhood-based retail, that sort of thing. LS5, very, very, very similar to the preceding. There are, of course, some use differences and bulk area height differences, but very similar function and purpose as the CS5, and once again, smaller lots to allow for services and close to residential areas. General commercial, this is very traditional commercial zoning, 60,000 square foot lot, so acre and a half plus lot, intended for larger shopping centers, sort of thing. And then you have your tourist commercial, TC80. And you have a couple of really interesting districts that are really catering to some well-established tourist areas. This and the aquarium area. So this being one of them. Marine commercial to account for your marine activities, including the marinas along the shore. Highway interchange. So this is very similar to your general commercial 60 zone. It's consolidated around an interchange of I-95 and some other state highways. And there's a McDonald's here, a shopping center. It's a fairly large but concentrated area. Now you have your village zones, Pawcatuck Village, PV5, and it's intended for a mixture of uses, intended to protect historic districts. You have Heritage Mill District, and that is really designed around some of the older mills that you have in town, supporting their reuse and continued use. You have a traditional M1 manufacturing district, for which you have some well-established businesses. Picture one on right. I'm not exactly sure what that business does, but it's a fairly large property. And you also have light industry, which differs a little from manufacturing. It tends to be less intense, a little less disruptive, so it can be a little closer to residential. As it turns out, most of the area in the light industry district is farmland, with the exception of this cooling and heating contractor, and everything else is farmland in that district. That might be something we have a conversation about in the second phase of this project, when we take a look at your districts and figure out whether or not they're in the right place and they're best suited for the land that's underneath them. So in addition to your Heritage Mill District, you have this interesting site, and I'm hoping someone knows what the status of this site is, because when I took a look at it, it looked like there was had been demolition, construction, reconstruction activity on it. And I'm sorry I don't have the street names for you, but there's a baseball field right here. Keith, do you know what the story is with this site? It's just this one site.
Yeah, there are a couple other IHRD sites in
there?
town, but this one
Okay.
is the site of a former mill, which was approved to be 40-something residential units,
Okay.
which just haven't been constructed yet.
Okay. But the building was torn down. It looked like the site was cleared.
Right. It's been looking like that for the past 10 years at least.
It has. Okay. Make a note of that.
There's a more successful example in town called the Thread Mill on River Road, which is an old mill which was revitalized into apartments.
All right. And that's not part of the Heritage Mill District, is it?
No, the Heritage Mill is different. It's a conventional zone, really only on those Mechanic Street mills in Pawcatuck.
Okay. Okay. Maritime Heritage District. That's your museum area and tourist area. So it's one of a couple different zoning districts you have. This one for the seaport. Neighborhood Development District is intended to encourage the reclamation and of underutilized commercial parcels for residential and mixed-use development. And you can see some fairly, I don't know how old it is now, it looks certainly less than 10 years old, newer development in this area.
Yeah, that development is the only NDD that was approved in town.
Okay. Is the NDD a floating zone?
It is a floating zone.
Yeah, okay.
There have been a couple other applications that were either denied or withdrawn, including a very large potential one in Mystic, which was very controversial.
Okay. So for those, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Keith. Anything else on that?
Oh, no.
Okay. For those that aren't familiar with floating zones, they are a zone that exists pretty much in theory. So the zone, all of the requirements of the zone, the regulations, the bulk area height, the allowed uses, all the conditions of the zone exist in your regulations, but they don't necessarily exist in any defined physical place on the zoning map or on your geography until someone basically makes an application requesting rezoning to that district. So it's a floating zone in that it can float anywhere and it can drop in place. And unlike an overlay zone, it isn't a set of conditions applied on top of the base zoning district, which remains. It replaces the base zoning district and it changes the rules for those properties located within it. And the advantage of this particular type of zoning and of this tool and mechanism is that you as a commission are under no obligation to rezone any area of town, even if you have someone who has an application, it meets all the requirements of this particular district. You do not have to rezone an area if you feel it's not in the community's best interest. That's how it differs from a base zoning district. If an applicant came forward and had an application that met all the requirements of a base zoning district, you basically cannot deny them that application. And so that's one of the strengths of a floating zone is you act in your legislative capacity as rule writers of rewriting the zoning regulations and really amending the zoning map to allow for development. And we can get into the weeds on that at a later date, but that's how a floating zone works. All right, we're not done yet though. You have a Greenway Development District and with some development that was underway when this Google Earth image was taken. That's intended to allow for larger scale development, a range of development types. And Keith, what is this project? Or is
It's a Hartford Healthcare Medical Office building. It's part of a large Perkins Farm complex.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. You have an agricultural historic district, a lot of farms located on it, including this one that I found. And so that's serving a very obvious purpose. These districts typically allow for, you know, a home construction at a very, very low density, designed to preserve farmland, but allow farmers to live on their land, that sort of thing. And your overlay districts, you have a downtown Pawcatuck parking overlay district, and that's intended to provide some parking relief and leniency in that district. You have a groundwater protection overlay district. You have quite a bit of your town is covered by aquifer protection areas. That's substantial. Some communities have not nowhere close to that. And so the protection of those areas is obviously pretty important. The GBR 130 we talked about earlier, it's if you were to overlay it, it maps out, there's a high correspondence between that district and the blue areas on the map that we're looking at. And that this overlay district provides an extra level of protection for the land uses within those areas. Sorry. Similar to that is the coastal area management overlay district, which has coastal inundation areas, and this is a program that's regulated by the state. There's no stated purpose within your zoning regulations. It'd probably be a good idea to put a little paragraph or passage in there that states the purpose when we revise them. But this is a state managed program. The flood hazard overlay district, high correlation with the coastal zone district, but also with some upland areas. these are your FEMA flood areas. And I think the importance of controlling, regulating land use in those areas is becoming very apparent to everyone as we have more severe storm events. Okay, so that was your districts. There are a lot of them. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And this it certainly will not be the last time we talk about your districts. As I mentioned in phase 2, when we're going to come back around and take a much closer look at the districts to ensure that they're appropriate as they are, to ensure the geographies are, all the lines are in the best place. You know, to have a discussion about whether or not there should be a consolidation of districts to simplify things, which isn't to say there needs to be, but we should probably have a discussion about that. In which case, I expect we'll have the official zoning map will be front and center in those discussions. Okay. All right. Let's talk about your regulations and the document itself. It is 348 pages long, which is probably part of the reason why we are here this evening. By comparison, the city of Hartford, we worked on this project several years ago now. We were on the team. It was a comprehensive team that rewrote the city zoning regulations, which had dated back to about 1968, I think, was the last time they were reorganized, I think formally adopted. We were able to produce a document that covers an entire city with more zones than you have, and it's a hybrid form-based code, which means it's a highly visual document with a lot of design guidelines embedded in it. And that document is only 283 pages. Providence, right? Providence, which closer to you than Hartford, I think, right? 237 pages. So I think we can do better, and we'll talk about that. Your regulations are organized in 9 articles, and so here's where you're very typical. 9 articles, an appendix, and this is about what we find in a lot of other places. So there's nothing unusual about this. It's just the page count, which is really eye-popping. So I compared you to a few other communities. I think the local ones make sense. Why Brookfield and Town of Canton, and the reasons being those communities recently did zoning rewrites and reformatting. And so I wanted to pull those for reference. And those are also communities that we did not work in. So I didn't want it to be biased by communities where we've done work, whether it's Hartford or Woodbury or Bristol or elsewhere. I want to see what other folks are doing. And those rewrites were done by 2 separate firms as well. And what you can see is a lot of consistency, right? Town of Brookfield, 236 pages, Canton, 228. Section counts are similar. When we look at a little closer to home for you, City of Norwich, Town of Groton, City of New London. Norwich doing all their work in 150 pages. Groton tried to cheat by beating you in the page count by adding a bunch of design guidelines to the back of the thing. But really the body of the zoning regulations is only 295 pages with a bunch of stuff stuck at the end of it from other planning efforts. New London, 284 pages. Number of sections are all pretty comparable. New London, a few more. Nomenclature, that is the numbering, lettering system. It varies across the board. I have to tell you, I don't know how fond that you folks are of your system. I have to tell you that the 5-digit system is I find really cumbersome. Like just even trying to read it to myself to remember where something is. 1.6, 0.7, 0.9, 0.1. You lost me at 3 digits. So that's something I really want to have a conversation about. I think at our next meeting would be the time to do it, is to put some sample nomenclatures in front of you and agree upon a system that will be most effective for you. Brookfield divides theirs up into articles like you. They have a 1-point or 2-digit numbering system, 1.1, 1.2, et cetera. Then they go to a letter system, which I think works pretty well. Canton does something similar. They just kind of stick it all together, but the same concept. They end with some Roman numerals, which is a terrible idea because no one knows what they are anymore. Norwich has similar numbering system, 5-digit Dewey Decimal System of zoning. Groton, and you can see on down the line. So there are different systems. I think it's incumbent upon us to pick something that will work best for you. And I'll put some things in front of you at our next meeting. I'll mock up some content so you can see how it flows. The definitions, I included definitions here because they're an incredibly important part of any set of zoning regulations. You could argue with an applicant quite a bit about what retail is or what a specific use is and what it is not, and everyone can pull their own dictionary definition. And you don't want to have uses, and this is most relevant to uses, but to terminology as well. You don't want to have uses that are undefined, because then it's ambiguous and it can lead to a lot of discretion on your behalf, which is a bad idea, and a lot of interpretation on an applicant's behalf, which is not good. So I like to take a look at how robust the definitions are in various regulations. And you have a lot of pages, but you're missing a lot of definitions, and we'll go over that in a couple of minutes. Graphics within the definitions are very helpful, and you do have a lot of graphics to help communicate the concepts and definitions, and most communities do, except for Norwich. That's how they trim down their page count. They left out any graphics. So with the exception of the page count, you look not dissimilar from your peer communities. All right, our line-by-line review of the regulations. We've been working on this for more than a month now. We've completed 5 articles, have completed 134 pages of review, which means we're not quite halfway there yet. I just took a quick screenshot of a page from that review, and as you can see, this is a typical page, right? Things that aren't in the best place, wording that is awkward, nomenclature that's challenging to follow, ambiguity about the type of permit required, statements that are unnecessary. That's some of the typical things that we're uncovering here. So to round that out, I've got a couple slides here with a list of issues that we've come across so far. And mind you, we're 134 out of 348 pages into this. The definitions are incomplete. Only 46 of 98 uses, or 46 of 98 uses are not defined. So almost half of uses that are allowed are not defined. So that's problematic. Fortunately, we have lots of good resources and sources for pulling those definitions into your regulations. So we know where to find them, but we have to put them in. Many common and irrefutable terms are defined, however, such as an acre. You have a definition of an acre. You probably don't need to define it because it's irrefutable. So let's just get rid of the excess, and that's a perfect example, and that's one of several. Regulation sometimes occurs within the definition. The definition should be for the purpose of just explaining what the thing is. You really should not regulate within the definition. And that would include, you know, retail store should only operate within the hours of this and that, right? Right there, you should be doing that regulation in a separate place. So any hours, any whatever it may be, regulate that within within a separate section of the document. It's not unless it's absolutely tied to what the thing is, it doesn't need to be in the definitions. Some references are dated. The sources no longer exist. Case in point, some of your noise and emissions standards reference a source that is 70 years old. I found it at the University of Michigan. They were kind enough to scan the document in and provide it online. So I found it. I think it's the only remaining record of that particular regulatory document in North America. It's out there. I don't know how well it's serving you though, because I'm sure it's outdated and it's hard to find that sort of thing. So there are issues such as that. There's some other, you know, more recent or common issues referencing back to the prior versions of the Plan of Conservation and Development and sections that were in that plan that are no longer exist in the newer plan. You have some subsections that are just in illogical sections or sequences, you know, whether they're just kind of shoved there because there was room on the page or whatever it may be. So there's some shuffling around that would need to occur. One of the things contributing to your page count is that you have identical information and regulations that are repeated multiple times throughout the document. And when I say multiple, I mean 10 times or more. By example, your regulation on pets is, and it's a good chunk, is repeated for every single residential district, and it's the same regulation over and over and over again. So that's really what's exploding your page count. And it really creates problems because if at some point that regulation is updated, whoever goes in and updates it needs to find it a dozen times. It isn't in one place. And so it leaves room for errors and omissions. There's some awkward and cumbersome wording in many sections, as you might expect, run-on sentences, passive language, that sort of thing that needs to be corrected. There is ambiguous language and a lack of direction as to who does what. Just says something should be done by whom, by what commission, by the applicant, by the town, right? So there's some ambiguity in areas. There are direct conflicts with state statutes and case law, and many of those being more recent. So I think we expect to find that. With the most common issue we found, and Keith was kind enough to share with me a document that's several pages long that's titled "The List" in all capitals. So it definitely carries an air of authority, and it was, thanks for saying that, Keith. It was a tremendous resource for us while doing our line-by-line review to kind of look for the items called out. And Keith and the rest of the team there were kind enough to put together a whole, almost a page of, you know, McKenzie violations. And McKenzie was a state court case which basically ruled that commissions really aren't enabled and aren't entitled to waive requirements as they see fit for general broad reasons. You have to really strictly enforce regulations, and you don't have a lot of discretion unless it can be very directly tied to or related to the health, welfare, public safety, protection of the community, that sort of thing. So there are some issues with that, and that being an example of case law. And I have some slides to review the most recent statutes and some of the conflicts there. You also have regulations that are redundant with state regulations and permitting requirements that are not enforceable by the town due to their regulations by state agencies such as DEEP. So if it's nothing that you can enforce, and the DEEP, there are state regs, and DEEP is already doing enforcement, it may not make sense to maintain those in your regulations. There is improper regulation of non-conforming uses. We need to clean up the language that you have. Basically, you put time limits on non-conforming uses that aren't allowed unless certain conditions prevail, so that needs to be cleaned up. There is a lack of clarity surrounding buffer requirements, which each district has a section devoted to what the buffer requirements are, and they seem excessive for many districts, so there's quite a bit of work to be done there. There are some unnecessarily complicated formulas in areas which we come across all the time, so things could be simplified. There is an over-reliance on special permits. We, in the course of our work, and this will probably happen in our second phase, we should really take a look at moving things towards zoning permit approval, maybe zoning permit, with site plan, but more administrative approvals, less special permit required. It really creates a tremendous amount of work for staff, for you as a commission. It fills up your agendas, requires public hearing noticing, and it's likely that there are a number of uses in specific districts that really don't justify a special permit. And it's going to take some work to figure out what those are and what people can live with, but that work needs to be done. And then finally, you have some great summary tables in the regulations. The trouble is they're followed by a half a page of notes with all sorts of asterisks and numbers and stuff, which really complicate their use, and those could be simplified as well. So that's the short of it. All right, one of the things we did, I just talked about the use of some of your tables. Fortunately, you do have a use summary table, a couple of them actually. And many of the communities we work with have never gotten to this point. It's all still just lists and text and writing. So this is a tremendous asset. There is a caveat in the zoning regulations preceding this table that says, if there are any discrepancies, the text shall prevail. Like this table is just a guide, it's just a reference. And it's good that you have that there, because we reviewed the table, and this was several hours of work by one of my very diligent staff, Zainab. See her notes to the right. We found 3 types of discrepancies. First of all, in the blue, you can see highlighted in the blue on the table, and this is one page of 3 or 4 pages of tables. I just grabbed one for your reference. There are permitted uses that are omitted from, not within the table. So we put this back into the table. It's identified in the text, but was not in the table. In this case, golf or country liquor permit as a permitted use was not in the table. In orange, permit requirements that differed from the requirement in the text. So that's highlighted in orange, a couple of them under agricultural homemaking. In green, there are variations on the name of the use, just some of it for brevity, some of it just casualness and copying information over. So that should be consistent. And actually, I say that should be consistent. What I would really like to move you towards, and we don't have to decide this evening, but maybe at our next meeting or at the subsequent one, a great way to get rid of, I don't know, 20, 30 pages of this document would be to get rid of the text section, get rid of the list of allowed uses by permit type that prevails for each zoning district that's repeated over and over and over again, and replace it with a simple table just as this. And that I would encourage you to go that route. So please start thinking about that. There are virtually no downsides. The only downside you could, I think, from my perspective, you could argue would be that when you're taking a look at a district, and if you're just concerned about that district, it doesn't contain 100% of the information you need. You have to go to a table that's in maybe a slightly different section on a different page and find your district and the uses allowed on that table. So there's just maybe a little extra page flip or two. But as you might imagine, it's incredibly valuable just to have everything in one place. And as you might also imagine, if there are revisions that are made to what is allowed in which district, staff could update this table in 5 minutes and be done, versus thumbing through the document, updating every single zoning district, whether it's changing the permit required or the allowed use. It's so much easier and completely eliminates the potential for discrepancies. So I would please start thinking about that as a possibility.
So in this idea, each zone would have its own summary table. It'll be like RA40, and there's the RA40 table that says, single family house, yes, and cemetery, no, or something like that.
I actually like the way you have it organized in this table, which is you have it broken out. We're looking at are residential zones. And so each column here is one of your residential zones. Starting at the left, GBR 130, where I started in the presentation, all the way down to the RA 15. And it's all in one place, in one table, versus separate tables for each individual district. This also, I would like to think it's beneficial to staff and to the commission to really help you see the big picture and understand how these zones relate and how they differ. It really helps you see it all together. And it helps you have conversations about, well, why do we allow churches in the RC 120, but not in the RR 80? What's the big difference there? Or why do we require a special permit in this district and not in this district? So I think that's the value of seeing it all together and having one place where all the information is stored. So give that some thought. Like I said, we don't need to make a decision tonight, but I'm going to encourage you to move in that direction.
Excuse me, this is Ben again.
Yes, sir.
Spencer, so you'd have a separate table for maybe the neighborhood district, all those special overlay districts, or
Yeah, you
don't
currently
have three
do
or four?
have
three or
correct.
four tables instead of one per.
Yes, you
Perfect.
currently do, and it
Excellent.
currently exists in the regulations. You do have another table that looks just like this, that is for commercial, mixed
Right.
use, industrial, special use districts.
Okay, thank you.
In much smaller communities that have far fewer districts, by example, Woodbury, we did their regulations a couple of years ago. They have 8 districts across the entire town, and we were able to get all of them residential, commercial, industrial, all on one table. You have too many for one table, but so I think the way you have it organized right now is perfect. It's just a matter of making sure this table is complete and reflects your
Accurate.
regulations as they are written, so that if and when we do get rid of all of those pages, we haven't lost any information and we haven't inadvertently changed what's allowed, how it's allowed.
Got it. Agreed. Thank you.
All right. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about all of the work that the legislature has thrown our way in the past couple of years. And that starts with a few different public acts and a Senate bill. One by one, let's walk through those. Connecticut Public Act 2129. This was the big one. There was a lot here regarding land use and zoning. This evening I will focus on the sections that are directly relevant to your zoning regulations. But this act had provisions for accessory apartments, a lot of provisions for the Zoning Enabling Act, which gives you as a community your authority to enforce zoning. Affordable housing stipulations, which basically the requirement for affordable housing plan, and land use official training, which you folks all know about this. You're going to have to start doing some mandatory training on a somewhat regular basis. It's the commission, for the commission. Keith, have you had this conversation with them yet?
Yes.
We did a while ago, you know,
You did? Okay, good.
pushing a year ago.
Okay, good. All
But
right.
you know, along with all the other dozens of things in this Connecticut Public
Yeah.
Act.
All right. So we don't need to talk about that tonight. I would want to talk about the things that have the direct implication for zoning. Accessory apartments, and remind me, Keith, did you folks opt out of this?
We haven't yet. We will hold a hearing on opting out, probably the beginning of October. The commission has talked about its preference to opt out of this because we recently did overhaul the accessory apartment regulations just before this act.
Good. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't recall where that stood, so I just wanted to make sure we talked about it. And there's a lot of restrictions here. It's good that you're taking a look at what your alternatives are so that you're more in control of what's allowed. And basically, the state's really trying to encourage the development of housing, and particularly housing that's affordable in any way that it can. Hence, this section of the act, basically mandating that communities allow accessory apartments unless they opt out by a certain date, which looks like you're well on the way to opting out. So I'm not going to go over all the exact stipulations of that act, but I do think this is very well intentioned, and accessory apartments can be a very good solution for homeowners, for people that need affordable housing, and likely be a good fit for you under the right conditions. So it's good that you're working towards improving your language and what's allowed. All right, here's where a lot of the work remains for us to do, because this is all obligatory. There's no opting out. And fortunately, most of it is just wording within the regulations. But there's mandatory provisions that zoning regulations needs to directly address, and a number of issues, including the protection of historic, tribal, cultural, environmental resources. We need to ensure the regulations consider the impact of permitted land uses on contiguous municipalities. Need to address significant disparity in housing needs, promote efficient review of land use applications, affirmatively further the purpose of the Fair Housing Act, eliminate provisions that allow considerations of character of district. So we need to be very careful with the use of character and decisions based on character. We just need to go a step further in being descriptive about what it is we really mean. And that's because for many years and decades, character has been used as a broad brush to basically paint something as not compatible with the community. Additionally, regulations must state that they shall expressly allow the development of housing which will meet the housing needs identified in the state housing plan. So we need to take a look at that plan, make sure your wording and regulations are sufficient to be aligned with that, and be made in consideration of public and ground drinking water. And I think you're doing a great job in that area with your various overlay districts and the way the districts are designed around the sewer and water infrastructure that's available. So I think you're in good shape there. Additionally, regulations, you're now explicitly allowed to, with regulations, to promote solar, wind, and other renewable energy sources. And you can create incentives for the development of those resources. You can also provide for require cluster housing, which has been practiced by communities for a long time, but it was never explicitly stated in statutes. So that's just allowing practices that have already been occurring. The same is true for floating zones and overlay zones, which have been basically ratified by the legislature as an acceptable planning tool. Now it may also use vehicle miles or vehicle trips as a measure of traffic impact instead of just level of service calculations. You can require the provision of potential traffic mitigation strategies as part of development application. And there are certain additional restrictions that can be placed on quarrying, clear cutting, where a trap rock or amphibolite ridges are located. So a whole new set of tools that are actually, many of these have been around, likely in your parts of it in your zoning already, but have just been made official by the legislature. Additionally, the legislature is telling us that you cannot do the following: prohibit the operation of a cottage food operation. And in case you're wondering what that is, that's someone making food out of their kitchen in their home for sale elsewhere. You have to allow them to do that, presumably as a home occupation. You cannot, and this is a big deal, you cannot establish a minimum floor area for dwellings. This will now be entirely regulated by building code. And FYI, building code actually can allow, if properly designed and meeting egress and fire safety and all the other requirements, can allow for a dwelling unit size as small as a 150 square feet. Actually, I think it'd be about 137, we rounded up. You can also not place a numerical or percentage cap on the number of mixed use or multifamily dwellings in a town. And I think you might have some language in the zoning regulations that ties dwelling development to percentage growth per year. And we have to take a look at that because that might not, that might be in conflict with the intent of this prohibition. Additionally, there's a few more things you can't do. Municipal zoning regulations cannot be applied to deny any land use application, including for any site plan approval, special permit, or special exception on the basis of, and here we're back to the character words, so they're just being a little more descriptive in what they're saying, but based on a district's character, unless you've sufficiently articulated that, and the immutable characteristics such as that would basically end up discriminating against people based on income, age, whatever it may be. In addition to that, you cannot require more than one parking space for a studio or one bedroom apartment, or more than 2 spaces for a dwelling unit with 2 or more bedrooms, unless, and this is an opt-out provision, unless you opt out. And Keith, is this a conversation that's been had yet about opting out of this parking?
We did. From what I
Okay.
remember, the commission wasn't really looking to opt out of this, but this one doesn't have the time limit by the end of the year like the accessory dwelling unit does.
Right. Okay. Once again, might want to control your fate, so something to keep on the radar. All right, section 182, outdoor dining. And this got bumped out. It originally was going to be effective a few months ago. It got bumped up to May 1st, 2023. So it lines up well with our work here. And section 182 basically says you have to allow basically all food retailers to do outdoor dining under certain restrictions, of course. We can walk you through. We've done a lot of research in this area because we're currently working with the city of Bristol to write the ordinance for outdoor dining. And we've got our heads wrapped around it pretty well, so we can walk you through what you can and cannot do and how you can manage this. So the nutshell of it, though, is it specifically allows a food establishment to engage in outdoor food and beverage, which includes alcoholic beverages, service by right, meaning no more than an administrative site plan review, until 9 p.m. in the following locations: on public sidewalks, provided they don't obstruct accessible access; on off-street parking spaces, regardless of what the parking requirement is and whether or not them taking up 5 spaces brings the establishment short of their requirement; and on any lot, yard, court, or open space that directly abuts the permitted principal use, provided it's in the same zoning district.
So just a note for the commission, on our agendas, we have the small thing at the beginning of each meeting. We call that administrative review. Other towns call it a consent agenda. But in state statutes, and usually in most cases, when they say administrative site plan review, they just mean purely administrative, reviewed by the zoning official and signed off without going to the commission.
Yeah. Right. And the idea being that you're not placing a lot of hurdles in front of these establishments. It should just be as simple as them coming in for a permit, providing the basic information necessary to confirm that it's in compliance with the state statute. So that's section 182. And this, I don't see this as problematic. I think you put a lot of guardrails around this to ensure that they don't become nuisances, and we can work with you on that. All right, Public Act 21-163, and there's another one related to this. We don't have to get into the weeds on this just yet. We've got some time. And it's already in effect, and it just basically defines and in some cases extends how long a permit is good for. And so 21-163, and I have no idea why the numbers are not continuous, because the next one is 21-34, and it's really the same thing. 21-163 applies to applications that were approved prior to 2011, and 21-34 is on or after July 1st, 2011. And basically, it's just providing a much longer, or defining and providing a fairly long time frame for permits. Now, there's a little bit of work to be done in this area, because a lot of communities use a special permit for something like an excavation permit, which typically has a fixed timeline. It has an expiration date on it to ensure that an applicant isn't tearing up a site for 10 years or whatever it may be. We have some decisions we should make around that, because by virtue of the fact you would call something like that a special permit, it kind of drags it in along with all these statutes, which suggest on its face that they would be good for 14 years. And so that's one of the things we'll take a look at. And what we've been encouraging communities to do is just to name them excavation permits. And any permit which is intended to be temporary, to to not name it a special permit. You could still have the same requirements that you require of a special permit, a public hearing, site plan review, whatever it may be. Just don't call it a special permit, so that there's a lot of interpretation here that someone could argue and interpret it differently and argue that their special permit for excavation should be good for 14 years. We want to avoid that. Okay. And then finally, this one's a lot of fun. Senate Bill 1201. And isn't this a responsible title for this Senate bill? An act concerning responsible and equitable regulation of adult use cannabis. It is effective basically immediately, July 1st, 2021. It was effective. And what this does is it authorizes you to do quite a bit of work to regulate any businesses that are dispensing. So here's the exact language. Authorizes municipalities to enact certain zoning regulations or ordinances for cannabis establishments. It also temporarily prohibits municipalities from granting zoning approval for more retailers or micro cultivators than a number that would allow for one of each for every 25,000 residents. Allows the DCP, Department of Consumer Protection, that is, commissioner to set a cap in the future. If municipalities take no action through zoning regulations or ordinances, so if you do nothing, you just ignore that this legislation is passed, then you have to treat these establishments like you would any other retail establishment. So wherever a convenience store is allowed or tobacco shop, you have to allow these in that same district by the same permit type.
So we did just approve our cannabis regulation at the last meeting last week.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, so
Wow.
I still have to finish writing up the final version to even
Okay.
send you.
Good. Good. You guys are on top of these things. That's excellent. So as you can see, it allows you to regulate, reasonable hours, signage, and location with respect to schools and that sort of thing. And so you do have a good measure of control over that. And all right, any questions or comments at this point before I jump into our review of these plans? All right, and here I'm really going to look to you as a commission, and Keith, you have all the institutional knowledge here to tell me what's been done and what will never be done. So what we did is we went through all these plans. We pulled out every recommendation for a zoning change there was across these 4 different plans. And I've got them all on the slides that will follow. And I'll try to get through them really quick. There's a lot, maybe that it just really nothing's happened, not for any particular reason. There may be some things that you've done already. There may be some things that you've determined are not a good idea or will never be done. And so we'll just try to rapid fire get through them. Starting with the plan of conservation and development. So it includes some general, here's broad regulations that it recommends. Improving protection of coastal and flood prone areas, updating and clarifying zoning regulations dealing with agriculture, update open space development regulations, allow community and institutional uses in village areas. Keith, the 2015, so 7 years out now. Are you aware of changes to the regulations that have been made in response to the recommendations of this plan? Any of these? I've got a couple more slides. So
there have been a few. The creation of the Pawcatuck Village District, the Heritage Mill District, agriculture somewhat.
I'm going to exit presentation mode so I can type in some notes as you go here. So the Pawcatuck
Village District is relatively new, in which downtown Pawcatuck now has its own zone.
Yep.
Heritage Mill District is similar. Um,
Good.
let's see. Agriculture somewhat with that agricultural heritage district, that floating zone,
Okay.
which is a new thing. It's only been applied to a couple of properties, but it's another option for farms. What I can do too is I have a running list of all the recommendations
Oh, great.
in the POCD and all the status so far. So, I can look
Yeah,
at that and
send that
send you what I
over.
have.
Yeah, that way we don't have to torture the commission over it tonight. Although that being said, commissioners, if any of you were involved in, you know, arguing for, involved in supporting, arguing against any of these recommendations, let me know. And I'll just flip through them quick. And Keith, you and I you can send me that. We can talk offline if we need to.
Yeah, yeah. Another big one was accessory dwelling units.
Okay. All right. So some more review the NDD and IHRD zoning requirements for potential updates, modify zoning regs to make more provision for mixed-use development, explore changes to the attached housing regs. Guessing that's your accessory dwelling units. And study.
It is different.
Oh, is it? Okay. Well, tell me about it a minute. Study adoption of IHC. These have really kind of fallen out of favor. They just haven't been an effective tool, but we could talk about that. So, yeah, your attached housing regulation, you were saying?
Yeah, attached housing is different than the ADUs. Attached housing is basically what we call multifamily.
Oh, your townhouse type housing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Did you explore?
We
Yeah.
we did. We had a grant to study that, so we had a consulting firm help us with that, and basically came to the conclusion that they wouldn't be a good fit for the town. It wasn't
Okay.
worth doing, but that there was other things we could possibly do.
Okay. Anything else on that slide that I mentioned?
No, I mean, there's been a few little extra provisions for mixed use development here and there, but there's definitely
Yeah.
room to grow with that in certain zones.
Okay. All right, and I've got 2 more slides of these. All right. Next slide, explore modification. Oh, here it is right here, the accessory apartments, which you've done to expand use accessory apartments. Encourage flexibility and creative adaptions regarding some flood hazard requirements in historic zones. Amend the LI 130 regs to allow agricultural uses and allow expansions to existing residential uses, and review text of the current regs to modernize language objectives and purpose of commercial zones, specifically the M1 and TC 80.
Yeah, the accessory apartments used to be very strict. So we liberalized that a few years ago. As far as flood hazard requirements, yeah, we did exempt historic structures from the definition of substantial improvement. So that can allow for more revitalization of historic buildings in floodplains. LI 130 zone, we did approve a privately petitioned regulation amendment to allow agricultural uses there, and there was a mushroom farm approved in that area.
Ah, okay, that's why I saw so much agriculture in that district. Okay.
Yeah. As far as the last one, there were some changes to the TC 80 zone that were approved that a property owner applied for.
Okay.
But they weren't comprehensive overhauls. It was basically
Right.
tweaking a few rules.
Okay. Oh, you folks have been pretty diligent working your way down this list. I'm impressed.
Well, some of it has been private petitions.
Yeah. Okay. And last page on the POCD, investigate the creation of a new zoning district for Maritime Drive that focuses less on manufacturing, better reflects current businesses on Maritime Drive. Investigate increased flexibility in parking regs, consider changes to zoning to offer additional flexibility for growth at Mystic Aquarium. Investigate changes to address some of the unique requirements of small and large marinas. And I'm guessing some of the districts that you now have for in response to this.
Really, I think the only thing that on this page that was addressed
Yep.
since the POCD was the third one about consider changes for flexibility for the future growth of Mystic Aquarium, where now that neighborhood development district NDD floating zone can be used in the TC80 zone where Mystic Aquarium is. So if Mystic Aquarium wanted to, they could apply to change their property to that zone to do more master planning, which Mystic Seaport can do in their floating zone.
Okay.
So far, the aquarium hasn't done
Right.
anything like that.
Okay. And there's the future land use map, which we have yet to really dig into this and see how your districts are lining up with the recommendations. I'm guessing there probably aren't any big changes that the future land use plan recommended. Is that right? Or
No,
yeah.
it largely follows current zoning.
Yeah. Okay. These plans are always very challenging to develop.
Mm-hmm.
All right, coastal resilience. It's a couple years newer. This is a really impressive plan. Multiple recommendations relevant to zoning. Specifically, it recommends loosening height regulations to allow for the elevation of homes and for mechanical systems to be elevated. It recommends considering ways to extend the boundaries of the CAM overlay district and the flood hazard overlay districts so that both districts account for areas that may not be in the current 100-year floodplain, but may be impacted by future storm events due to sea level rise and storm surge. Any progress on these fronts, Keith?
No. You know, with
Okay.
the second bullet, I'm just wondering out loud how that would work, because the
Yeah.
way it is now, you go by the FEMA maps, and
Right.
our rules are the same as the building code's rules, and this would change things up and have two different sets of rules.
Yeah, I mean, just because it's there doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? But we certainly want to take everything into consideration. Okay, and I've got one more slide on this one. Review exception of single-family residential structures from coastal zone regs. Review base flood elevation requirement to determine if a higher standard is needed. Allow sufficient elevation of homes to accommodate parking below structures, and allow encroachments into yards to allow for stairs to elevated structures.
Nothing new on this page.
Okay. Just make a note to myself. All right, we're making good progress. The affordable housing plan, very, very recently completed. And lots of zoning recommendations, as you might imagine, as related to accessory apartments, duplex units, multifamily, mixed use, the RH10 district, really recommending comprehensive review of uses and encouraging the use of inclusionary zoning, and get into that a little more. So specifically, consider reducing the minimum of 2,000 square foot total area provision from the existing regulation to expand the opportunity for accessory apartments in smaller single family residential properties. And Keith, where does this stand? You had mentioned doing some work recently on the accessory.
This hasn't changed.
Okay.
You know, the work recently was a few years ago.
Okay. All right.
Prior
Yeah.
to the state statute.
Right, this plan's a couple months old. All right. Consider allowing duplex units on minimum lot sizes that are the same as the minimum lot sizes for single-family residential units in the districts where duplex units are allowed. Anything on that?
No, no.
Yeah, I mean, I expect you haven't made any progress, but do you think this is anything that would get any traction?
Maybe it's hard to know,
Yeah. Okay.
you know, whether people would go for the idea.
Yeah. All right. Consider allowing semi-detached single-family housing with a zero lot line provision. Basically, just to allow for townhouses where the townhouses are individually owned, not part of like a condominium, not part of an association on a large parcel, but everyone has their parcel is the width of their townhouse. So, you know, relatively new idea. And a lot of these ideas I expect we can address in the second phase of our work. When we reach out to the community, we can ask them these questions in a survey. We can ask them at a workshop. We can explore whether or not any of these ideas are viable with the community. Other ideas coming out of the affordable housing plan is consider allowing multifamily residential uses in zoning districts that are currently served by public water and sewer. So allow it in more areas or where it's feasible for community septic systems to be developed. Consider allowing multifamily residential uses in commercial zoning districts. Review unit maximums and review the lot area requirement per unit and allow coverage in parking to constrain unit yield. So that this is basically saying don't put a density limit or a maximum on the number of units, just, you know, regulate through your bulk area height coverage standards, parking requirements. By example, if you have a 2-acre lot and it's in a area that's allowed for multi-unit housing, you know, don't put a limit of 50 uses or a density of 25 per acre. Just let the physical conditions constrain it. You know, through your coverage limits, they can only build on so much of the lot. They have to provide parking. They can only build so high. So there's only so much they'll be able to build. So don't, I think this is getting at is don't overly regulate it. Review minimum percentage of commercial uses required to allow better market demand to determine the mix of uses. This is for you mixed use areas. Ensure that you're not requiring too much commercial so that it doesn't crowd out the potential for housing development. And consider allowing residential mixed use in additional commercial zoning districts that have public water and sewer. And 3 more recommendations coming out of the affordable housing plan. Consider reducing the building size and the rehabilitation of existing buildings provision, and consider permitting flexibility and allowable densities under this section in the PV5 zone. That's the Pawcatuck Village zone, to encourage redevelopment of buildings. And we'd have to get into weeds on that, on those numbers to see if there's really some room for that to move. Study and analyze the RH10 zoning district, possibly add a provision to allow investments and renovations that modernize the housing stock regarding of non-conforming status of the property. So that, you know, really driving this idea here is the non-conforming issue, and what can you do to make it possible for property owners to improve, expand if needed, non-conforming properties, assuming you want to go in that direction. And finally, consider creating an inclusionary zoning provision that requires all residential developments of a certain size to provide a minimum percentage of units that are qualified as affordable housing. All right. Most of these, I don't expect we're most, maybe not, maybe even all of these I don't expect we're going to directly address by this first phase of the plan. I think most of this work really requires community input and much bigger discussions, and I think is very appropriate for the second phase.
Excuse me, Francisco.
Yes, sir.
The select women in town plan to put together eventually a committee or a advisory group, if you will, on affordable housing for the next 4 or 5
Okay.
years to go over a lot of these details and come up with their own plan that will meet the town's approval in various public hearings and public meetings.
That is very good to know, and that might
It has not been
save us some grief.
Yeah, I think it ought to. Maybe we could almost postpone a lot of this and leave that up to the advisory committee. I don't know what you think,
Yeah.
Keith, but it's going to be formed. It hasn't been formed yet, but I know it's
Okay.
on Danielle's mind to do this fall, if not winter.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the time frame of it, which would come first, how quickly this group would deal with these issues. Because there was sort of a controversial public hearing when we were considering adopting this plan, and a lot of the members of the public wanted this new affordable housing committee to be formed to study these issues. So
Good.
So I'm just not sure of the time frame of this in relation to this project.
I was thinking we almost leave this document alone and let the advisory committee take the reins.
Yeah, I guess the issue is the affordable housing plan does have a lot of these meaty issues.
Yes.
That should be addressed in zoning.
No.
It may be that we could carve this up and we confer with first selectmen and women and ask them, hey, what issues, what recommendations are you comfortable with us moving forward with
Good idea.
in the course of our work? What can we put out to the public? What do you think is viable?
Great. Yeah.
And then we could create two lists. One list of things that we could move forward with that they think is worth consideration now that we can do in the course of our work, and another list that they see as far more complicated and problematic that they can address through the course of their work.
That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, and you can sort of see for some of these the division already. Like the last bullet on the screen now, consider requiring inclusionary affordable housing where developers have to set aside a certain percentage of their units as affordable housing. That seems like a big issue that this affordable housing committee should look at. Some things like eliminating the cap of 10 units on any mixed-use development project is a little bit of a no-brainer for this commission. Because the way the rules are now, even if you have a gigantic commercial property like Old Mystic Village or some large big box commercial development, and you wanted to build mixed use there and build some residential units, our zoning regulations limit you to 10 units per property, period, no matter how big the property is. So that's something that, that committee probably doesn't have to dig too deep on.
Okay, sounds like we've got a good approach then.
Agreed.
Good. And finally, the open space plan. This is the oldest plan, 16 years old now, but it does have some zoning recommendations. And maybe given the fact that it's been around for a while, maybe some of this stuff has been done. Starting with establish guidelines to incorporate conservation design principles into land use regulations to ensure that residential and commercial development is sensitive to the natural characteristics of the area. I do think a lot of your buffer regulations and infringement areas, that sort of thing, does a pretty good job of doing some of that. And the second one is a little more specific to that exact issue. Develop regulations to require open space considerations during development along rivers, streams, watersheds. Followed by require the amount of constrained land, such as wetlands within an open space set aside, be proportional to the amount of constrained land within the overall development, unless waived by the commission for good cause. So, yeah, we could take a look at that. Cap effective impervious coverage to 60% in new commercial developments. And Keith, anything to note along these lines?
No, the third bullet there about the percentage of constrained land,
Yeah.
might sound good on paper, but with our open space developments,
Mm,
it's caused a lot of problems and has been
okay.
sort of a disincentive to people using it.
Okay. All right. Anything else to note? Any of these other recommendations?
Nothing really.
Okay. All right. I've got one more slide from the open space plan. Design an enforceable regulation to protect properties and features adjacent to scenic roads. Adopt a buildable land regulation to reduce pressure on sensitive areas. Develop open space development regulations, including design guidelines and standards. Add non-infringement area to RR80. Convert some RR80 to GBR 130 north of I-95. And require conservation easements or other measures during approvals.
I think since then, the town did develop and adopt the open space development regulations. A while ago, the commission had a subcommittee that looked at adopting a buildable land regulation and decided against it because it was just too complicated and
Okay.
limiting, really. The one about converting some of the RR80 land to GBR 130, I don't know how old that recommendation is. I think,
Yeah.
maybe back in the 90s that was done for a good chunk
Okay.
of land.
Okay. Good. All right, so that concludes our review of those plans and their zoning recommendations. And, I realize it took a little bit of time to get through that, but it's very much worth our while to go through all these plans and ensure that all of the work that went into those plans, all of the hand-wringing regarding what the most appropriate recommendation was, that we're carrying that work forward as we do our work. So it's really important. So with that being said, let's talk about our next steps. Our next steps are to continue our line-by-line review. I think by next month we can get through all 348 pages. I think we're on track. We are then going to identify issues raised by that line-by-line review that require discussion with you at our next meeting. So a lot of the matters, we're going to end up with a couple hundred comments that we've noted in our review. A lot of those are going to be very straightforward. We're very clear as to what needs to be done. We'll review and discuss them with Keith, and it's just a matter of doing the work. It's nothing that we are likely going to need to get your consultation on. However, we're going to separate out some of those comments where we really need your feedback and consultation, approval, guidance, whatever it may be, before we move forward with any revisions in responding to those items and issues. So what we will do is together a bunch of slides that walks through those individual line items and the problems we're seeing, and we're going to consult with you as to how to address this. We may have some ideas as to how to handle those issues. And it's a matter of just bouncing those off of you. So that I think a good part of our meeting next month will be spent discussing those line item issues. We will also prepare and provide you with some sample document outlines and formats. So I talked about nomenclature earlier. We'll give you an idea of what the page could look like, and the type font, the numbering system, how the regulations would be reorganized in terms of the outline, the flow, what is where, and we'll put some of that in front of you. And if we can, make some decisions, or at the very least start thinking about what format we'd like to use. That way, as we get into the fall, we've got a format and start plugging content into. We can start building the new document. Okay, with that said, any questions or comments thus far?
This is Ben again. I'm impressed how much you've already covered, Francisco. This is great. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're making
you.
good progress. I'm pleased too.
Yeah,
Very
you are.
comprehensive so far.
I certainly agree, Mr. Chairman. I'm very, very impressed. I've been through several previous exercises, and I was impressed with FHI Studios when we interviewed them, and with the methodical process that they proposed. And that now that we're into it, I'm even more impressed. This is very, very constructive. Very.
Agreed.
Well, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
Well done.
I
Yeah,
sincerely
very well
appreciate that feedback. This can be a challenging subject matter to make interesting and engaging. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You took a very difficult subject and you laid it out very well, and you are very well prepared. So very well done. Thank you.
I
Thank
appreciate
you for the hard work.
I appreciate the pace as well. It's good to keep it zooming right along. Well done.
Yeah. Try.
That said, Mr. Chairman, I'm at home alone with our dog, and the dog is melting down as a result of the thunderstorm here. So I'm gonna have to get off the call here now. So, but
Good luck,
I do
John.
appreciate it. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you.
Great.
And
Okay.
Have fun in my
finally,
as well.
our next
Okay.
meeting is, and this is going with the 4th Tuesday of September. That puts us at September 27th.
Right.
And that would be at 7 p.m.
Okay.
Okay. Francisco, this is Fred Dykman.
Yes.
I wonder if it'd be possible for you to email the slideshow at a serious disadvantage here doing this by phone. And I wondered if you
Oh,
could
sorry,
send that
you weren't
on
able
to
to
me.
see it. Okay. Yeah.
I can do that right now because I have all your addresses.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
No,
you.
no rush.
I
No
should have
rush.
done
won't be home
that
for-
at the beginning of the meeting so you could have followed along.
And actually, a couple
I-
people's power went out during the
Oh,
presentation as well, so those would be good to have.
Okay.
yeah, so in the future, yeah, Keith, it probably makes sense for those of you, for whatever reason, can't join online and can only join by audio or excuse me, by your phone, don't have a live feed, whatever it may be. We could send that out prior to our meeting so you could download it if you can't see our presentation for whatever reason.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. And I will get a PDF. Well, Keith already has the PDF, so it's a matter of sharing it. We'll make sure that you have the PDF of the last meeting too, for those of you that don't have it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Okay. Good night.